You've seen it in every movie. Vikings screaming, half-naked, swinging axes like wild beasts, charging into chaos. But that's not what really happened, because if you had stood in a Viking battle, you wouldn't have seen glory. You'd have felt fear. The kind that tightens your chest and makes your hands shake before the first clash of steel. Viking warfare wasn't about rage. It was about discipline, about survival. And to understand how they truly fought, you have to step into their world. Not the one from Hollywood, but the one they lived and bled in. It's dawn on the coast of England. A thick mist hugs the ground. The horn hasn't sounded yet. You're standing shoulder to shoulder in the shield wall. Wood pressed against wood, brother against brother. The man beside you is shaking, but he doesn't move. No one does. Across the field you can hear the enemy, another wall of men breathing, waiting. You know the moment that horn blows, everything will explode into violence. And yet for now it's silent. Only the sound of rain tapping on helmets, the smell of earth and iron. You grip your shield tighter. The commander whispers one word, hold. Then the horn sounds, a low thunderous call rolling across the valley. The ground shakes. The walls move. And in the next heartbeat, the world disappears into blood, splinters and screams. This wasn't the battle of legends. This was the reality of Viking war, methodical, brutal, and far more human than the movies will ever show. Yet somehow, that reality was buried beneath centuries of legend, replaced by the image we all know too well. The shirtless Viking, eyes wide with madness, charging into a storm of arrows with no armor and no fear. Hollywood made us believe that Vikings were wild beasts, powered by rage and chaos. But the truth is, they couldn't afford chaos. Real Viking warriors didn't fight shirtless. They wore layers of protection, thick wool tunics, hardened leather armor, and, for the fortunate or experienced, chainmail known as brinja. These weren't primitive savages. They were professional fighters who valued preparation as much as courage. A single wound could end a life, and with it, an entire family's survival. Archaeological finds from Scandinavia and England tell a story of careful craftsmanship. Helmets, mail links, and iron fittings, showing how precious armor was, repaired and handed down across generations. Even the berserkers, those famed madmen of battle, weren't uncontrollable monsters. Their fury was a ritual, a weaponized trance to silence fear and ignite courage. In truth, Vikings didn't scream because they were fearless. They screamed because they were human, and fear demanded noise. But when the screaming stopped, what came next revealed the true heart of Viking warfare. What followed wasn't chaos, it was order, a brutal kind of discipline that kept them alive. In films, Viking battles are madness, warriors crashing into one another in a whirlwind of blades. But real Viking combat was built on structure and control. Their deadliest formation was the shield wall, a living wall of wood, iron, and flesh. Each man's shield overlapped the next, creating a barrier that could absorb the shock of charging enemies. The front line braced for impact while the rear pressed forward, forcing momentum like a tidal wave. It was a contest of endurance, not frenzy. Imagine it. The sound of wood splintering, men grunting in unison, the air thick with breath and fear. You don't swing wildly. There's no room. You push, you stab, you survive. If one man faltered, the wall cracked, and in that crack, death poured through. Victory didn't belong to the strongest, but to the most disciplined. The side that held formation longest usually won, and when one shield wall finally broke, panic rippled through the ranks. Men turned, fled, or fell beneath their comrades' boots. In moments, the field shifted from battle to slaughter. That was the truth of Viking combat. Not a screaming mob, but a rhythm of control and collapse. When the shield wall fell, so did the illusion of glory. And with that collapse came another myth, the idea that every Viking was born to fight. We love to picture every Viking as a warrior, axe in hand, hair wild, eyes burning for conquest. But that image leaves out most of their world. The majority of Vikings weren't soldiers. They were farmers, craftsmen, and traders. They fought when they had to, not because they wanted to. War was just one part of a much larger life. During spring and summer, men went Viking, setting sail to raid or defend, chasing wealth and survival. But when autumn came, they returned home. Fields needed tending, livestock needed care. Their families depended on them more than any chieftain did. The word Viking wasn't an identity. It was an activity, a temporary role like sailor or raider, only a small group. The herdmen, elite household warriors, trained year-round, protecting jarls and kings. These weren't endless wars fought by nations. They were seasonal clashes between clans, or raids planned like business ventures. So when we imagine a society built entirely on blood and conquest, we forget the truth. Most Vikings weren't chasing Valhalla. They were trying to make it through winter, because behind every warrior's axe was a plow waiting at home. And that brings us to another misconception, the idea that their battles raged endlessly, like scenes from an epic saga. Movies love the long, drawn-out battle, heroes fighting for hours through waves of enemies. But real Viking combat ended fast. When two shield walls collided, chaos erupted. But it didn't last. The instant one side's formation buckled, panic spread like fire. The losing side broke ranks, and that was it. Most battles lasted minutes, not hours. There were no duels, no cinematic slow-motion swings. Just short, sharp bursts of violence, bone against metal, breath against mud. Many warriors never even saw their killers. Those who survived spoke of exhaustion so deep they could barely lift their arms, of hands locked in cramps from clutching shields too long. When the noise faded, the survivors scavenged the field, looting the dead and tending to the wounded. There was no triumph, only relief, because war wasn't a grand adventure. It was a gamble with death, and every man knew that the gods didn't promise a glorious end, only the possibility of surviving the day yet. This brings us to one of the most enduring myths of all, the idea that Vikings wanted to die. It's often said that Vikings charged into battle welcoming death, dreaming of Valhalla's feasts. But that's a half-truth told too loudly. The belief in Valhalla gave courage, not carelessness. It helped them face fear, not erase it. Every Viking feared dying forgotten, nameless, unburied, lost to time. Sagas tell us of warriors trembling before battle, whispering prayers, kissing charms. They weren't fearless. They were deeply aware of their mortality. Their strength came not from recklessness, but from the discipline to face what terrified them. To die well was to die remembered. That's why they sang of courage. Not because they lacked fear, but because they carried it and fought anyway. They were fathers, brothers, sons, clinging to belief as their only armor against terror. So when we imagine them as bloodthirsty savages, we miss the point. Their power came from humanity, not from madness. And speaking of madness, no image has twisted that truth more than the myth of the berserker. The berserker, half man, half beast, biting shields and howling at the sky. Legends claim they took hallucinogens or drank potions to become unstoppable. But what evidence tells us is something more complex and more chilling. Berserkers were elite warriors, handpicked to shock and terrify. They trained relentlessly, mastering both body and mind. Their fury was performance and psychology, a weapon as powerful as their axes. Before battle, they worked themselves into trances through chanting, breathing, and ritual, not chaos, but control. Their purpose was to break the enemy's spirit before blades even met. Maybe a few used herbs to heighten senses, but madness wasn't the point. The point was fear, your fear, not theirs. The berserker wasn't a man who lost his mind. He was the man who learned to turn fear into dominance, and that kind of control, mental and physical, was the cornerstone of Viking warfare. Because underneath all the violence, there was strategy. And that leads us to the final truth. Viking warfare wasn't about brutality alone. Viking warfare was brutal, yes, but never blind. They were master tacticians, using intelligence as their sharpest weapon. Their longships weren't just symbols of conquest. They were tools of precision. Light, fast, and built for rivers as well as sea, these ships let Vikings appear and vanish like ghosts. They struck where the enemy was weakest, monasteries, trade routes, undefended coasts, and melted away before armies could respond. They studied terrain, tides, and timing. They scouted, planned, and exploited weather itself as a weapon. To them, war wasn't about slaughter. It was about advantage, and when swords couldn't win, words did. Many Viking leaders negotiated peace, served as mercenaries, or became rulers through alliance and settlement. The land we now call Normandy, it began as a Viking deal, not a battle. So yes, they could be ruthless. But the true edge of their power wasn't forged in blood, it was carved in cunning. And that's the truth beneath the myth. Vikings weren't wild beasts or reckless savages. They were thinkers, survivors, and soldiers bound by discipline and fear. Their battles weren't endless chaos. They were moments of method and terror, lived by men who understood the cost of every heartbeat. And when the noise of battle faded and the shield walls collapsed, what remained was silence, broken only by the cries of the wounded and the crows circling above. The Vikings we imagine, fearless, savage, larger than life, are ghosts shaped by legend and cinema. But the real men behind those stories were far more complex. They weren't born for war. They were dragged into it by duty, by hunger, by loyalty. They fought with discipline, not fury. And when the fighting ended, they returned home to their farms, their families, and their gods. For them, battle wasn't glory, it was survival. And maybe that's why their memory still grips us, because deep down, we recognize ourselves in them, our fear, our will to live, our need to make meaning out of chaos. So forget the movies. The truth of a Viking battle isn't about rage or bloodlust. It's about the courage to stand side by side and face the storm,